Imagine this, a quiet Colorado town asleep under the snow, when police dig up a backyard that's been hiding a secret for 19 years. Inside, they find the remains of a young couple who vanished in 2006. But here's the part that shattered everyone. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was the man who'd been leading the local search for them all those years. The same man comforting families, giving interviews, and raising money for justice. Turns out he was living with their ghosts, literally. What investigators found in his basement left even seasoned detectives in tears. Because what he kept there wasn't just trophies. It was a shrine to his victims, to his guilt, to his obsession. And when they finally opened that last locked room, they realized this man hadn't just fooled town. He'd fooled his own soul. Before we dive deeper to see how they uncovered the darkest secret Colorado had ever buried, hit subscribe and like for more cold cases and chilling mysteries. They found the photograph in a shoebox at the back of a closet, yellowed around the edges, the glue tacky with a time that had long since hardened into silence. It was of Marcus Hale and Lila Cortez laughing on the hood of an old pickup, the mountains bristling behind them like a distant, indifferent audience. Both of them were 22 in the photo, faces that still knew the future as a bright thing you could take apart and put back together. The shoebox belonged to Arthur Keene, the man who would be cuffed at dawn, and whose name had been spoken in the town like a bad prayer for as long as anyone could remember. The arrest stunned Breckenridge, Colorado, the kind of stun that crushes the teacups in a cabinet and leaves the town fumbling for words. Arthur was not supposed to be the kind of man who could hold two lives in his hands and then let them go. He had built homes here and fixed roofs, taught Sunday school, given donations with the carefully folded generosity of someone who feared his own reflection. He had run marathons with younger men, kissed a wife on the courthouse steps, and sat at the front of community meetings with a pen that made him seem official by habit alone. For 17 years, the town carried the ache of Marcus and Lila like a private weather system. Heavy, certain, impossible to predict. The night they disappeared in October of 2006 became a history class, a cautionary tale told with lowered voices on porches. Two young people leaving a party, a flat tire at the edge of a road, a last call heard by the radio in an empty pickup. Then, nothing. The sheriff at the time was gray-haired and weary. Investigators followed every thread they could find until the threads grew thin and slippery. The case cooled into a file stamped closed, but always labeled with a question mark that no one could answer. Detective Nora Alvarez had been 17 when it happened. She remembered Lila's mother, Claudia, at the precinct rocking on a chair as if the floor might tilt and reveal something hidden beneath. She remembered Marcus's father, Ed, bringing a thermos of coffee and staring at the rows of folders like they were the bones of a map. Nora had been a local kid, and the disappearance had seared itself into her, the way a single unresolved thing will burn into a place until everything else circles around it. It guided her choices like a compass needle that refuses to rest. Now she was 40, her hair threaded with gray and her patience refined into a surgical thing. She'd specialized in cold cases because the quiet of them suited her. You could go back over evidence, breathe life into old holes, and sometimes, like now, find something stubborn enough to answer to. The break came not from a lucky eyewitness, not from a confession scribbled on a diner napkin at 3 a.m, but from a flicker of modern science, and one woman's refusal to let the story end. It started with a simple DNA retest. For years, the forensic lab's cooled freezer had been a kind of stone heart, and when Nora finally convinced county officials to authorize a new analysis of the evidence, trace hair found beneath a passenger door seam, a smudged fingerprint on a cigarette, but DNA that had never matched anything in the old databases. She felt like she was asking the town to look again at a face they had been taught to forget. The lab sent the samples through a line of machines Nora hadn't known existed when she was a rookie. Touch DNA, mitochondrial profiling, and a new kind of genetic genealogy that stitched family trees together with the precision of a spider's web. What the machines whispered back was a tangle, distant relatives, a surname that had drifted across counties, and finally, a name that belonged to the people Nora had driven by hundreds of times without thinking, Arthur Keene. She felt at first like a punch, then like a quiet, enormous relief. The genealogy didn't convict. It pointed. It made Arthur a person of interest and pulled his silhouette into the light. Nora put together a small team and began to reopen doors. She interviewed 40 people who had known Arthur. She sat with Claudia and Ed and watched their faces move like film, sometimes still, sometimes jumping frames. She visited the bar where Marcus and Lila had been last seen and held the photo up to the bartender, who remembered the night and the laughing young couple who had argued about whether to take the long way home. It was the shoebox that did it. Arthur's ex-wife, Janine, had called in tears after a routine estate cleanout turned up the photograph. She had moved across the state and tried to live with the decay of 2 decades, but when she packed up Arthur's things, she saw something that made the past fold forward. That picture glued with care into a cheap plastic sleeve. Janine hadn't known the photo existed. Arthur had kept it hidden, or maybe he had just been someone who kept things just in case. An old letter, an unused key, a ticket stub. She found notebooks, 2 pages of careful lists and coordinates, names crossed out in a hand that had once been so steady. Nora read the notebooks and found, between lists of materials and sermon notes, a journal entry, "They don't know." Under it, in a shaky hand, a line that made her stomach hollow. "Two gone, no one asks." The first arrest that morning, Arthur in bright fluorescent cuffs, felt like an image from an old detective show that had been tuned for a new century. The sheriff's deputies moved quickly, polite but firm. Arthur carried his own coffee mug. He smiled with the small, practiced charm of a man who had believed he had been invisible. He did not resist. He seemed as surprised as anyone. The town reacted the way towns react to the improbable, in waves. People lined the courthouse steps like someone watching a play from a distance. Comments had been folded into the years. He'd never heard a soul. "It doesn't make sense. At least we'll finally have answers." Social media ignited, old quarrels and old sympathies flaring like dry tinder. News vans arrived with their cables and their microphones. The town's quiet suddenly broken into the static hum of the country watching. Inside an interrogation room painted a color meant to be soothing. Nora watched Arthur sit. He was thinner than she expected. His hands trembled. He wore the same watch he had in the photo, the watch with a cracked face that reflected the fluorescent light like a small moon. "You knew Marcus and Lila?" Nora asked, keeping her voice small and even. She had learned that tone over years, how to be patient without being passive. Arthur leaned back. He folded his hands and looked at his knuckles as if they were someone else's. "I knew them," he said. I built Marcus's parents' deck. I watched them from the community center sometimes. They were kids then, beautiful kids." "Where were you the night they disappeared?" Arthur swallowed. His right knee bounced. He had the nervous habits of a man who had campaigned and shaken hands and stared out church windows at sermons. "At home," he said. "At the house. I was working." His voice carried the ring of someone repeating a rehearsed lie. Nora had seen it before, the cadences of deflection, but she also saw something else, a person who expected to be believed because he had always been believed. "We have your DNA near Lila's car," she said. "We have it on a cigarette, but recovered 20 yards from the scene. We have a photograph of you with them that was hidden away. We have your journal." Arthur's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, and his eyes flashed with something Nora didn't like to name. "What are you accusing me of?" he asked, and his voice was both fragile and dangerous. Exactly what Nora was not ready to say yet: murder. She kept herself steady. "We're asking you about their disappearance. We're asking you about the night they didn't come home." He laughed, then a soft, incredulous sound. "No one asked me for 17 years, he said. "No one knocked on my door." The first whisper of a defense murmured through town. Procedural error. Everyone remembered the earlier investigation, the rushed searches, the missing note of a deputy who had retired, the hairs collected but never tested because the technology didn't exist. People looked at the sheriff, who had signed the warrant back then, and at Arthur, who had been allowed to keep his sermons. Rumors are elastic. They bend to the shape of a person's need to protect what they love. But Nora had the boxes of evidence stacked like an altar in the cold case room. photographs, clothing, receipts, the cigarette butt. She had watched the lab director, a woman with a stiff hair bun and incisive eyes, point to the screen and say, "The match is significant." Not absolute, but significant. The genealogist had traced the sample through half a dozen collateral relatives before landing on Arthur's family tree. She had called it the kind of match that deserved a look, a deeper dredge into the well. When Nora asked Arthur why his DNA would be there, he told a story about generosity and younger bodies, how he had given Marcus spare break work and had watched Lila at the community theater, about how he'd walked past them at a party and had watched them argue about whether to stay the night. He painted himself small and harmless. But there was the journal and the shoebox and a mechanic's receipt with Arthur's handwriting for a tire change around the time the couple's truck had been seen stalled. There were his purchases that matched the materials used to construct a shallow, hidden space near Willow Creek, a place Nora's team excavated and where they found objects that could not be explained away as random debris. A bracelet, a scarf, a single earring. They were not the bodies. Nora would not describe the deaths, but fragments of a life that ended and left pieces like punctuation. Claudia and Ed went to the press conference, the two of them speaking with the kind of brittle control a person develops when grief becomes a long-term job. Claudia's voice was small but precise. "We want him to tell us what he did with their bodies," she said. Ed's hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. "We want them back," he said. "If he did something, tell us where they are." Arthur's attorney, a man with a slow, polished manner, insisted that Arthur would be exonerated. He said the evidence was circumstantial, that men had been jailed on less. He asked for bail and painted a picture of a community man unfairly accused. Families took sides like a map of loyalties. Some defended Arthur's years of volunteering, his steady smile. Others remembered offhand remarks, a shadow where a joke had been told. Seeds of suspicion ran deep into the town's soil and sprouted accusations that could not be easily weeded out. What the community didn't know, what Nora knew, was that such cases are rarely tidy. People keep secrets that don't belong to them. Arthur had a story threaded through his life. A series of small, unremarked errands at odd hours, a penchant for driving scenic back roads at night, a habit of collecting things that had no obvious purpose. It added up to something like guilt when held up to the cold light of a lab's findings. But guilt is not the same as proof. Evidence is a grammar all its own. Arthur's trial was scheduled like a painful rite. The media circled, the courtrooms filled, and the town's past dragged its feet into a new date. Nora watched as old friends and new enemies took their seats in the gallery. Marcus's mother wore a bracelet she had not taken off in 17 years. Lila's sister had cut her hair in a way that made her younger in a way that felt like armor. In the weeks before the arrest, Nora had haunted the edges of Arthur's life. His construction sites, the church basement where he played chess, the diner where he ate alone on Tuesdays. She collected small things, names of men who had once stayed for coffee and spoke in whispers. The neighbor who remembered a fire Arthur had burned in a barrel the week after the disappearance. The barista who recalled him buying cigarettes late that October night. She assembled the narrative with a detective's economy, facts placed with care. And then, in the hush before opening statements, something else surfaced. A young woman named Haley, who had been a waitress at the bar where Marcus and Lila had last been seen, came forward. Haley had been shy and anxious in 2006 and had not been taken seriously. She had followed the case from afar and had kept a secret for years because she had been afraid. Fear is a strange currency. Its interest compounds with time. Haley testified that she remembered seeing Arthur argue with a couple outside the bar, heard Lila shout something about a secret, and then remembered a dark blue truck with a dented fender that matched the photograph of Arthur's truck in Janine's album. Her testimony was not conclusive on its own, but it pushed the story over a ridge into a valley of suspicion, so deep it would echo. The combination of Haley's memory, the lab match, the shoebox, and the notebooks created a lattice the defense could not easily pull apart. The prosecutor spoke with a voice that felt like a gavel. "This is not about villainy invented," she said. "This is about the slow work of truth that catches up to a man who kept his secrets well." Arthur, during cross-examination, looked like a man who had been asking himself for years whether he had done something terrible, and then convinced himself he had not. When the prosecutor read a passage from his own journal, they looked at me with something like trust. I kept them close. No one has to know. Arthur's eyes flickered, as if he'd been surprised by the handwriting. He said nothing in his defense that could undo the weight of the items on the table. The town watched the televised testimony like a flock watching migrating geese. Old allies whispered. New enemies sharpened their tongues. People who had never known each other before found themselves binding together in small groups, repeating the same facts until they were almost a prayer. Some brought flowers to the edge of the creek. Some brought anger. The arrest itself, the cuffs, the image of Arthur stepping into the sunlight with his shoulders oddly stooped, had been a first act. The trial was the second, and the confession, when it came, was something both expected and impossible. It did not come as a theatrical moment. It arrived in the quiet hours on a rain-soaked Tuesday, when Arthur's attorney called Nora and said his client wanted to talk. Arthur sat with a cup of hospital coffee in a visiting room, fingers laced, the muscles in his jaw going through a negotiation. He told Nora he had thought about death often, and of how easy it can be to believe the world has a script for you. He said he had kept the journal like a talisman, sometimes rewriting the past line by line until it fit him. I can't tell you everything, he told her. The statement that followed was careful and partial. He admitted to being at the bar that night, to following the couple when their tire went flat, to offering help, and then to something that began with anger and ended with a silence, so complete he could not parse it. I didn't mean for them to die, he said, the line weary like an old road. We argued. Marcus pushed me. I hit him. I didn't know what I'd done. Lila tried to stop me. She fell. I panicked. Nora listened with a professional distance she had learned to cultivate, even as her body registered the old ache she had carried since she was a teenager. She documented the confession as precisely as she could, asked the necessary clarifying questions, and then said the words that any detective must say. Where are the bodies? Arthur's answer was a sentence Nora would never forget because it was not the one the town had expected. I don't remember, he said. I remember panic and headlights and a flashlight. I remember the creek. I remember the feeling of the cold water. I remember thinking if I left them here, no one would find them for a long time. He spoke of holes he had dug and filled, how the earth had swallowed things like a hungry thing, how he had driven to a dump and left small things in crumpled bags. He gave locations that sent search teams out in the rain with high-visibility jackets and shovels, and each place pulled up fragments, a boot sole, a comb, a piece of fabric. None of them were the whole. He told Nora there had been a storm that washed the trail away, that animals had scavenged, that the land had spasmed in ways that turned evidence into rumor. The confession cut deep into the community's fragile assumption of order. For some, it was vindication, a judge's gavel hitting the sound of all those years of questions. For others, it was a fresh wound. Claudia and Ed, who had inhabited sorrow like a second skin, said little at first. They stood with hands clenched and eyes empty. People wanted the closure that comes with a grave, with a place to kneel and name the dead, and Arthur's confession offered only more questions. There were moments of unexpected tenderness during the proceedings. An older woman bringing a casserole to Claudia. Teenagers organizing a candlelight vigil at the foot of the mountains. The town tried to stitch itself back together even as it unspooled. There were arguments about whether closure could ever be obtained from a man whose memory of the bodies was clouded. There were questions about whether the justice system could ever repair something so violently broken. Then the cliffhanger arrived in the quiet way that seems almost cruel. A lab tech called Nora late one night because a box of old film had been found in the county archives that no one had known existed. The film was from 2006, grainy, half-exposed frames of a festival the county had held in the fall. There, for a few seconds captured in the jitter of an old camera, was Marcus and Lila walking together near the creek. Behind them, barely more than a suggestion in the film grain, was a figure with a shovel over his shoulder. The figure's outline matched Arthur's stature. But behind that figure, In a frame that flared like a signal in the dark was another shadow, shorter, broader at the shoulders, moving with a purpose that did not belong to the person carrying the shovel. Someone who did not appear in the investigation's original notes. Someone who had been ignored or perhaps deliberately erased. Nora watched the frames again and again until the pixels took on the intimacy of memory. The person behind Arthur, their face too blurred to make out, walked in step with him toward the creek. The camera's light caught a flash of metal and the whisper of movement that an old film sometimes records like an echo. The discovery of the film changed the case in a single brutal instant. Arthur's partial confession was now flanked by the possibility of an accomplice. If true, it meant the town's relief could fracture into anger at whoever else had been involved and into the terrible recognition that the person who had been taken for granted might not have been acting alone. If false, it meant someone could be painted into the frame by the randomness of light and shadow, and a life would be ruined by the photograph's cruel lie. The legal team convened. The prosecution added an investigator to the team and sent out a request to comb through old records for anyone who had been in the area at that date. The landscaper who rented equipment, the transient who had been seen on the highway, the man with a dented truck who had been mentioned in a bar's late-night gossip. The defense called foul. They said the film was grainy, that it could be anyone, that the town was looking for a scapegoat. Newspapers pined for details. Talk radio hosts replayed the frames of the film until it felt like a dance in the town's mind. Claudia watched the new development like a woman seeing a dream shift under her feet. If there was someone else, she said one night at the kitchen table, they owe us. They took our children from us. Her voice was a thread. If they were alone, then I will forgive the wilderness for taking them. But if there was someone else, someone who helped him, then I want them under the light. Nora felt the weight of Claudia's words the way gravity catches a falling thing. The idea of an accomplice opened the case into a wider geography of guilt and secrecy. Where there is one secret, often there are others. And where there are others, the town could be implicated in ways that made the ground under anyone's feet slippery. Arthur, meanwhile, sat in his cell with a kind of weariness that made him seem small. Sometimes he wrote things down. Sometimes he stared into space and mouthed words that slipped into no one's ear. He did not know, he said, if the other person was there that night, or if he had imagined it, then convinced himself later. His memory was a cracked mirror. I remember panic, he told Nora once. I remember headlights and mud. Sometimes I dream the faces are easy to read. Sometimes they blur and become something else. I am tired of not knowing. And that, the lack of knowing, became the cliffhanger that no one had asked for, but everyone needed. The trial paused and pivoted on the film. The prosecution called in a new specialist, someone who could use modern software to analyze old grain and stabilize the frames, to enhance what was almost nothing into something that could be argued in a courtroom. The defense called their own expert and said the software manufactured evidence out of noise. Outside the courthouse, someone painted over a mural that had once included Marcus and Lila's smiling faces. Someone else left a bouquet with the word Y on it in black marker. The town watched the legal teams claw at the pixels like sailors at the rope of a mast, looking for purchase. People took sides. Old friendships strained into new alignments. Many nights, Nora drove past the creek where the water glinted black and thought about the way the light had caught the shovel and the silhouette. She kept replaying the footage in her head, looking for a clue the machines could not find. In the weeks that followed, new witnesses stepped forward, people who had been drunk and afraid, people who had been intimate with Arthur in different ways, people who had seen things they had not wanted to remember. Some of them told stories that were small and unthreatening. Arthur hauling planks at odd hours. Arthur asking the bar owner for extra coffee. But one man, an ex-con who had drifted through town in 2006 and had returned for reasons he could not explain, told a different story. He remembered being hired in the fall of 2006 to watch the creek for a man who paid him in cash and beer. He described a truck with a dented fender and a man who had a scar on his hand. The man's memory was imprecise. He had been high and terrified. Yet he described a laugh that belonged to a man he called AK, Arthur Keene. His testimony gave Nora the pattern she wanted, but not the certainty. People will tell different truths depending on whether they want to be kind or cruel, or simply free of guilt. Truth, Nora had learned, was often stubborn for asking the same question in many different ways. As the trial reconvened, the film was enhanced and then questioned. The witnesses were cross-examined. The town listened with bated breath. Arthur's partial confession would be judged against the possibility of another hand. The court would decide whether his memory, patched with remorse, was enough. The cliffhanger tightened. If the film proved another man had been there, who was he? How many secrets had the town held in its pockets? Was the murderer a stranger or someone the community had trusted? Nora realized that the case had become a litmus test for the town's own soul. The question was not only who had done it, but what the town would do now, how it would balance the need for closure against the temptation to fold the story back into kindness for the sake of itself. In the last scene before the pause, Nora stood on the courthouse steps in the cold, early light and watched Arthur pass by beneath the flag that fluttered too fast. He looked like a man who had been broken into pieces and then reassembled poorly. In the crowd, Claudia and Ed held hands and did not speak. Lila's sister stared at the ground. Someone had written on a piece of cardboard and left it leaning on a wall. "Tell us where they are." Nora carried the film on a DVD in her pocket like a totem. When she slid it into the projector that night and watched the frames run in silence, she noticed a detail that had been missed: a sliver of a license plate on a truck that had been half obscured by mud. It was a string of numbers that, when transcribed and run through an old database, matched a truck registered to a man who had moved away that winter and whose name had never been fully checked. The data point was thin, but it was a handhold. The story stops here for now, at the edge of revelation. An arrest has been made. A confession has been offered. Pieces of evidence whisper of more. A film from a dusty archive shows a shadow that could mean another person, another crime, another heart to reckon with. The town waits on the cusp of a new truth and knows, with the old, patient knowledge of those who have loved and lost, that answers do not always bring peace. Sometimes they bring more questions. Sometimes they bring the uncomfortable, aching necessity of looking at a neighbor and asking what they have done. Nora closes the case file and puts a ribbon around it. She thinks about Marcus's laugh and Lila's smile in that old shoebox photo. She thinks about the shoebox itself, the safe, small place humans put the things they cannot name. She thinks about the way a town can hold two dead people like a fragile thing, and for 17 years keep the ache folded carefully in the center. She does not know what the next day will bring. She only knows she will be there when the light comes up, when someone else speaks, when a number is traced, when a shovel is found, when another witness decides memory is stronger than fear. She knows the story is not finished. Outside, the mountains keep their silent watch. The creek runs on. The town waits, the people tethered to their own private reasons for wanting the past to be dragged into the light. Somewhere beyond the courthouse steps, something moves in the dark that might answer or might destroy the fragile kind of justice they all hope for. For now, the case rests on a photo and a confession and the dangerous possibility of another hand. The town will wake tomorrow and turn toward the courthouse again, and Nora will bring the DVD into the lab and let the images breathe under harsh fluorescent lights. Somewhere, someone who knows more is living inside a memory they can no longer keep quiet. And in a shoebox at the back of a closet, the photograph of Marcus and Lila lies face up, their faces bright with a future that never happened. The picture keeps its secret only as long as a town allows it to. The rest, where the creek bends and a shovel rests, who else was present, what the hidden pages of Arthur's notebooks meant when read together, waits, like a second breath, for the next person brave enough to demand an answer. The following morning, Detective Nora Alvarez sat in her car in front of the lab, the sky still a pale gray bruise over the mountains. She had barely slept, the image of that half-hidden license plate flickering in her mind like an afterimage. The cold from her coffee bit her lips as she stepped out, file in hand, the thin envelope of the DVD tucked under her arm. Inside, the forensics lab hummed with a quiet insistence of machines. The analyst, a thin woman named Corinne, met her with a tight expression. "You were right. Corinne said without preamble. That plate number, partially obscured, but cross-referencing the digits with county DMV records from 2006, gave one hit. Nora leaned forward, pulse ticking in her neck. Who? Corinne hesitated. The truck belonged to Sheriff Dale Rowan. The words hit her like a nail through wood, sharp, final, impossible to pull back out. Rowan, the sheriff who had run the original investigation. The man who had publicly wept with Marcus's father, who had organized the town-wide search, who had stood in front of television cameras, swearing they would bring those kids home. The man who had retired quietly to a cabin on the edge of the same forest, where the bodies had never been found. Nora's mouth went dry. You're certain? Corinne nodded. The make, the partial plate, even the dented fender in the photo. It's the same truck. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Then Nora said, almost to herself, he was supposed to be the one looking for them. That afternoon she drove up the mountain road toward Rowan's cabin, the wind scouring dust against her windshield. Each turn narrowed, the trees closing in like witnesses. The road curved toward the creek, that same creek where the couple had vanished, where Arthur had claimed to leave their bodies. Rowan's cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, small and tidy, smoke curling. He was 71 now, still broad-shouldered, his beard trimmed to the same square he'd worn in every news clipping. When he opened the door, his face registered mild surprise, then the measured calm of a man used to keeping his pulse slow. Well, if it isn't Detective Alvarez, he said. To what do I owe the pleasure? Nora studied him. I think we need to talk about 2006. He gave a small chuckle, stepping aside. You and half the state lately. Come in, I'll make coffee. The cabin smelled of pine and old smoke. Photos lined the walls. Rowan shaking hands with governors, with families, with smiling faces now lost to history. In one, Marcus Ailes' parents stood beside him after the first week of the search, Rowan's hand heavy on Ed Hale's shoulder. You still chasing ghosts? He asked, setting 2 mugs on the table. Sometimes ghosts chase back, Nora replied. She reached into her coat and placed the photo stills from the film on the table. Recognize this? Rowan leaned closer, squinting. Looks like one of our festivals. God, that's ancient. She slid the second image forward, Marcus and Lila walking by the creek. The blurred figure behind them. The glint of metal. The license plate. Something flickered across Rowan's face, an imperceptible twitch near the corner of his eye. But his tone stayed even. You're saying that's my truck? It's not a guess, Nora said quietly. We confirmed it through DMV records. Rowan exhaled slowly and sat back, the chair creaking beneath him. You've got an old photo and half a plate number. 17 years ago, everyone in this county drove trucks. You're chasing shadows, Alvarez. Nora watched him, the way his thumb tapped once, twice, against the mug's rim. You were there that night, weren't you? For a long moment, Rowan said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked audibly. Then he smiled, a slow, careful stretch of lips. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking if you helped Arthur Keene bury 2 kids by that creek. His hand froze. The silence between them thickened until Nora could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then Rowan leaned forward, voice low. You really think that idiot could have done all that alone? It wasn't a denial. It was worse. It was the sound of something rotten finally exhaling. Why? She whispered. Rowan rubbed a hand over his face. Because sometimes you do the wrong thing for what you tell yourself are the right reasons. Keene was a fool, a drunk. I found him that night by the road, crying, shaking, babbling about an accident. Said the boy was dead, the girl hysterical. I didn't believe him until I saw the blood. I should have called it in. What did you do? I panicked, he said simply. I was sheriff. It would have been my failure. A scandal that had stained the department forever. 2 dead kids. The county already hated my office for botch cases. I told myself I'd fix it quietly. He gave a brittle laugh. You ever try to fix death quietly, Alvarez? You can't. Nora stared at him, disbelief curdling into horror. So you help him? I helped the town, he said. Or that's what I thought then. We buried them near the creek. He promised to leave. I kept the secret because that's what small towns do. We keep things tidy. And when people kept asking questions, his eyes grew flat. You learned to shut them up gently. Redirect the search. Call off volunteers. Time does the rest. Nora rose, the air gone sharp and thin. You let their families suffer for 17 years. Rowan's expression didn't change. You think guilt ever leaves, detective? It doesn't. It just moves in and sleeps beside you. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. Inside were 2 silver bracelets, tarnished, soil-stained. One engraved with Marcus, the other with Lila. I kept these, he said. I thought maybe someday I'd hand them over, tell the truth. But then time went on, and it got easier not to. Nora's hands trembled as she picked them up. You're confessing? He gave a small nod. You already have enough to hang me. But you should know, it didn't end with them. The words chilled her blood. What do you mean? Rowan's gaze drifted toward the window, to the endless sweep of trees. Keene wasn't the first. There were others before. Missing girls, runaways. He'd bring me things, trinkets, excuses. I thought he was just lonely. But when you look long enough into evil Alvarez, it looks back and convinces you it's ordinary. He stood slowly, his movements calm. I tried to stop him once. I thought I had. But some men, they're bottomless. You're telling me Arthur killed more people? I'm telling you the creek holds more than anyone's ready to see. A sound came from outside, gravel crunching under tires. Rowan turned his head slightly. He's here. Nora frowned. Who? Rowan's smile was a broken thing. Arthur. Before she could react, a dark blue truck, the same one impounded months earlier, rolled into the clearing. Arthur Keene climbed out, face pale, eyes fever bright. He shouldn't have been free. He was awaiting trial. But as he walked toward the cabin, something in his posture told Nora he was past caring about courts. You told her, Arthur said softly, voice shaking. You finally told someone. Rowan didn't answer. He only looked tired. Arthur took a step closer, his hands trembling. We had a deal. You said it would stay buried. Nora's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm. Arthur stopped. He ignored her. You were supposed to protect me, Dale. You said you'd make it disappear. Rowan's voice was almost gentle. You did that yourself. Arthur's face twisted. You don't get to play saint now. He lunged. The sound of the gunshot was small, almost polite. Arthur staggered backward, shock blooming across his features before he crumpled into the snow. Rowan stood holding an old revolver, smoke curling from its barrel. For a moment, time fractured. Nora shouted, drew her weapon, moved forward, but Rowan turned the gun on himself before she reached him. The second shot cracked through the cold air and echoed off the trees. When silence returned, it was absolute. 2 bodies. 2 men. The truth bleeding out with the same inevitability as the past. Nora called it in, her voice steady by habit, though her hands trembled. Backup arrived an hour later. The cabin became a crime scene, tape fluttering against pine trunks. Paramedics pronounced both men dead. Inside the drawer where Rowan had kept the bracelets, they found more, rings, lockets, bits of bone carefully wrapped in cloth. Evidence logs would later match them to 3 unsolved disappearances from the early 2000s, women whose cases had faded without closure. The creek, when dredged days later, yielded remains that would take months to identify. But the real horror came from Rowan's journals, dozens of them stacked neatly in a chest under his bed. In careful handwriting, he had recorded every detail of the cover-ups, names, dates, locations. And scattered among them were letters never sent, confessions addressed to Claudia and Ed, the parents of Marcus and Lila. One entry, written a year before Nora reopened the case, read simply, I hear them sometimes at night. The water talks. It says I buried the wrong thing. The revelation detonated through Breckenridge like dynamite. The man they had trusted most, the law itself, had been complicit in the very evil he'd sworn to fight. The church bells tolled the morning after the news broke, but no one went inside. People whispered that maybe evil wasn't a stranger after all. Maybe it wore a badge and smiled politely in grocery stores. At the press conference, Nora stood before the cameras, exhaustion hollowing her features. She gave the facts with surgical precision, leaving out nothing and offering no comfort. When reporters asked her how a town could live with such betrayal, she said quietly, "You don't live with it. You just learn how to keep breathing through it." The funerals came weeks later, joint memorials for Marcus and Lila after their remains were finally identified, and smaller, quieter burials for the forgotten victims Rowan had helped disappear. The townspeople filled the cemetery hill, faces pale in the mountain wind. Claudia Hale approached Nora after the service, her eyes dry, her voice thin as paper. "Do you believe in forgiveness, detective?" Nora hesitated. "I believe in truth." Claudia nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's enough." That night, alone in her apartment, Nora reread Rowan's final journal. The last page was dated 3 days before his death. It contained a single line, "There's one more Nora. You'll find her when the snow melts." The words sat like a curse. Spring came early that year. When the thaw reached the creek, children playing near the bend stumbled upon a half-buried shape tangled in roots, a woman's skeleton, wrists bound, fragments of uniform cloth still clinging to bone. The tag on the collar was faded, but the letters were visible enough for Nora to read when she arrived on scene. Ann Alvarez. For a heartbeat, she thought she was hallucinating, until she realized what she was seeing wasn't her, but a uniform nearly identical to hers, down to the old department insignia used years ago. A trainee badge still clipped to the pocket. Dental records identified her as Renee Alvarez, Nora's older sister, reported missing in 1995, when Nora was only 12. She had disappeared during a routine patrol with a deputy named Dale Rowan. The case had been dismissed as a runaway. The truth split her open. Rowan had been haunting her lifelong before Marcus and Lila. He had killed her sister. Keene had helped bury her. The realization hollowed the world around her. Every moment of her career, every decision to chase justice, had been shaped by the man who'd murdered her own blood and watched her grow into a detective under his mentorship. The department offered her leave. She refused. She spent nights at the creek, the sound of water carving through silence, her sister's ghost woven into the current. By summer, Breckenridge was a different town. Houses sold cheap. Locals avoided the forest. The sheriff's department was dissolved and restructured. People whispered about curses, but Nora knew curses were just truths that never got buried deep enough. She took one final trip to Rowan's cabin before it was torn down. The place smelled of dust and pine. In the corner, she found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, a box containing a single cassette tape labeled for Nora. She played it in her car, engine idling, the mountains throwing long shadows over the valley. Rowan's voice crackled through static. "If you're hearing this, you found her. I tried to stop him after that night. She saw too much, and Keene panicked. I could have turned him in, but I didn't. I buried them both, the truth and the girl. You grew up in the same town her ghost never left. I saw you join the force, and I thought maybe that was her penance through you. Maybe God has a cruel sense of humor." He paused, the tape crackling. "You're everything she was, Nora, stubborn, righteous. Don't let this town tell you justice means forgetting. It means remembering, even when it rots you from the inside." The tape ended in static. Nora sat there long after, the sky darkening to bruised purple. She could feel the mountain watching, the creek murmuring the same endless sound it had whispered for decades. When she finally stepped out, she took the tape and the bracelets and threw them into the water. They sank without a ripple. Back in town, people would tell stories. How the detective who solved the cold case went silent afterward. How she moved into a small house by the creek and stopped attending services. How she still walked the banks at dusk, talking to someone no one else could see. Years later, hikers would find a marker carved into a rock near the waterline for Marcus, Lila, Renee, and all the things we tried to bury. Some nights, locals swore they could hear a woman's voice carried on the current, repeating a single line over and over. "The water remembers." And that was the cruelest truth of all. The town had spent 17 years trying to bury its sins in the earth, but the earth had a way of spitting them back out. Breckenridge would never be the same again. Because in the end, the most chilling thing wasn't what the creek gave up. It was what still might lie beneath it, waiting for another thaw, another detective, another truth too terrible to stay hidden. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.